What's going on? Welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be kind of talking about this suspension package that I'm going to be putting on the Tundra, and we'll be installing it later on in this video. So overall, we have Fox's new 2.5 inch diameter DSC dual speed compression coilovers and shocks for the front and the rear of the truck. Up front, this is a true coilover, so it's going to be adjustable in height all the way from 0 to 3 inches of lift, and it does have an external reservoir that's going to help kind of dissipate a lot of that heat when we are doing a lot of compression and doing a lot of suspension travel with these coilovers. Now this does have a low and high speed adjustment in the compression, so it allows me to tune it for the road as well as tune it for when we are off-roading. And in the rear, it's going to be basically the exact same thing. We are going to have the external reservoir over here for more oil, and as well these are going to be dual speed compression, so low and high speed adjustments on these two. I can't just throw these on just the shocks and the coilovers themselves. Over on the left hand side you can see that we do have some Dobson coil springs that are going to be going in the rear of the truck. Currently the suspension that I have right now is a little bit soft in the rear, so upgrading that is going to allow me to have a more of an even balance throughout the truck. And I did decide to opt for a 200-pound spring for all the weight that I'm going to be having in the back of the truck. Now when you do a lift like this, it's a good idea to upgrade your upper control arms. So over on the bottom left you can see that we have Camburg's upper control arms. Those are going to help kind of realign the suspension geometry so that we aren't overextending those upper control arms at the standard ride height. And when we go off-roading, it's going to allow a lot smoother travel of the suspension. Now the benefit of ordering this entire kit is it's going to be pretty much direct bolt-on. We don't have to do any sort of assembly other than the upper control arms, which is going to be really the hardest part. These coilovers from Fox are a direct bolt-in. They come already assembled. The only thing we're going to have to do is, once we get them in the truck, is adjust the ride height to where I want it. So in this video, we're going to start with doing the rear of the truck first, just because that's going to be the easiest, and we're going to be installing those coil springs and the rear shocks. And then we'll move on to the front, installing the full coilovers as well as those upper control arms. Now if you are looking to pick up a kit like this for your Tundra, it does take a couple months to get everything to your house. Mostly the front coilovers took the longest. Everything else came in within about a month, while these coilovers took about 2 to 3 months. I ordered most of this stuff from Runnin' for Tacos. I will be sure to include a link down below for you guys to check out this suspension package for your truck, as well as other ones that they offer.
So we're going to start this off by removing the sway bar end link on both sides. This is going to help pretty much take a lot of tension off the rear end, and it's going to allow us to kind of move it up and down a little bit easier. And after you have the sway bar end link taken off and moved aside, then we can transition into removing the nut for the top of the shock. Now one thing I recommend you do is get whatever jack you have and put it in the center of the rear axle, so that when you start to take this stuff apart, the axle doesn't just drop down on you. You have some control over it. It's going to pay off a lot later on when you go to take the springs out as well. When you go to drop it down, it's going to be a lot easier to pick it back up and get it back into place. That top nut is a little bit more challenging. You kind of have to use 19 millimeter, one of these pass-through wrenches that allows you to do like coilovers and stuff like that. And then I just used a basically adjustable wrench here to get the right size and loosen that top one. Now we can take off the shock by getting rid of that lower bolt, taking that one out as well. And this one down there is going to be a 17 millimeter. So now that both sides are done, both sway bars are disconnected, both shocks are disconnected, now I'm going to use that jack that I had placed center of the axle, and I'm going to slowly lower it down and try to be as even as possible so that these shocks kind of come out of their slot up top. And then I now will have access to take out the rear springs as well. Now as you are lowering the rear axle, keep in mind that your brake lines are still going to be connected, so you don't want to go, if you're going to be going really low, make sure you take out the brackets that hold them on so that they don't become under tension. As you can see, this is still loose, and the inside ones are still loose as well. So it's pretty much as far as I can reach right now, unless I start to take off some of those brake line brackets, which most likely we're going to have to do. So in order to do that, there's one small one towards the outside, and then there's one towards the center that mounts to basically the frame that goes across. And you can take those two out. Just be sure to make sure you put those back in once you go to raise that axle back into place. So now you can see the spring it's pretty much free. I just have to put a little bit of downward pressure and it will come out. But before that, I'm going to take out the shock on the other side and make sure as we lower this thing as low as possible that nothing else is binding up in terms of cables or sensors or anything like that. So as you can see, the rear end is moving completely freely now. So I should be able to get this spacer out that I have on top. Just needed a little bit of love, that's all. So here you can see the difference in the factory shock here on the right with that 1-inch spacer and then the new Dobinson spring. I have them completely even on that side, and you can see that these new springs are about 2 to 3 inches taller, expected because they are supposed to be carrying more weight. Now it's going to be a lot harder to put these in and load them up because these were already kind of challenging getting that rear axle low enough. So it's going to be quite a problem trying to get these in. I think we're going to have to kind of raise one side and then raise the other as we go to put these in. Obviously we're not going to be using this spacer anymore, but we're going to want to put in these new cones again. But before we get into kind of putting everything, all the new stuff onto the truck, we can now install the external reservoir bracket. These are going to be the ones for the rear that look kind of a little bit larger, and then they do have some self-tapping screws that we're going to use in this hole here to mount them up. So the way that this bracket is going to fit, it's pretty cool how they made it, is there's that bolt right here, and it's going to basically sit like that underneath this sway bar bracket that mounts to the frame, this piece here. So I'm going to remove that bolt and basically put it back into that larger hole in the bracket, and then once we get that lined up, then we're going to do a self-tapping screw into the frame with that smaller one with these screws provided. So by using spring compressors, it should make this a little bit easier. If you place a jack underneath the opposite side of the axle you're trying to get the spring in, so lift up like the passenger side, for example, and then that basically, with that jack in the center, creates a fulcrum point and allows this to drop down. So you can pretty much get the spring in without having to use the compressors too much. Still recommend you use them just so that you have a little bit more room to work with when you get those in there. But now we have the rear springs completely in, and now it should be a little bit easier getting these shocks all set up as well, now that we have those brackets in place. So now we can move into installing the fun part, the Fox shocks. So with this, it's going to be just like installing the OEM stuff. We're going to take all these bushings off, the top nut, slide them up into the tower, and then slide the bottom over the axle kind of stub that points out. Get all these kind of tightened down a little bit, but we're not going to torque them all the way until we get everything kind of back into position, such as the sway bars. So now we have the shocks in, the springs in on both sides. Now we can start kind of doing everything in reverse order by connecting all of the brake line brackets back up, sway bar end links. Actually, come to think of it, just before we're doing those end links is when I'm going to actually want to do the self-tapping screw. Just because I wanted to make sure that the shocks and the actual reservoirs met up perfectly with the bracket before I basically permanently mounted that bracket to where it is. So right now I have everything oriented to where I want it. So now I can secure the bracket exactly where it should be. So now everything is bolted up. We have obviously our shock top and lower nuts on. Springs are in, reservoir bracket is on, and I was able to get that screw in there as well. And there's how the reservoir sits. It does sit kind of a little too far away in my opinion. I think there should be a little bit more slack in this hydraulic line here. It does move around a little bit, does have some play, but these elbows are fixed. They don't move at all. They don't allow any swivel, so that's something that I hope is not an issue. Fox have designed suspension for trucks like this for plenty of time, so I'm sure that they know what they're doing with that. Hopefully it works out well. But that's pretty much it for setting up the rear. Everything has been torqued down to OEM specification. Just gonna throw the wheels back on, and then we can start on the front. So to start, we're gonna disconnect the sway bar and the tie rod end from the spindle here on this side. And these are gonna be 19 millimeters. So in order to disconnect the tie rod, this is one of those castle nuts. So we'll have to take out the little pin that's in here. So pin comes out, and then we can take that castle nut off. Now that we have those two off, now we can move up to the upper control arm and disconnect this castle nut as well. And then once we get the nut off, there is a little bit of tension on this upper control arm. So we're just gonna kind of pretty much hit the spindle here towards the passenger side, and this should just pop right out. Now we're gonna wanna remove pretty much all these brake line cables that connect to that upper control arm. So the next step here is to remove the sway bar brackets. So it's gonna be this first front bolt, and then there's another bolt back behind. We're gonna move this bracket and lower it down because this is where we're gonna be putting those spacers in. It's gonna be a 17. Let's break the other side loose, and then we can take them all out. After installing the blocks, they kind of just fit underneath the brackets. Now that the sway bar spacers are in, we have them up front, up top with the Fox logo, as well as the extended reservoir bracket is installed in place there. Can now move on to removing the original strut. We're gonna move all the bolts up top, and then we're gonna move that bottom one. Basically, we can move this tie rod out of the way. When you take this off, it's most likely gonna wanna drop this whole spindle and lower control arm. So make sure you have a jack or something supporting this before you go ahead and take that off. And this is kind of the point where it wants to fall. Started like dropping it a little bit here and there until it clears, and then you can kind of lift this up, wiggle the bolt out, pick up the coil and take it up and out of that little bucket. There we go. So if you're not planning on doing upper control arms, you can pretty much skip this part. However, I highly recommend you do it. Even just with that Westcott lift, not having an aftermarket control arm that corrects the caster. I really noticed it when driving. It puts a lot of bind kind of in your suspension in some areas. So now we are gonna move on to installing the Camburg control arms. But first we're gonna need to kind of assemble them and do a little bit more prep inside the wheel well here. So in order for us to remove the control arm, we're going to need to break loose the nut that's on the back side here. And this is one giant bolt, so this is actually gonna pass through the front. And then once we remove that, we'll be able to take off the stock upper control arm. So now we can start the process of assembling our upper control arms. To start, we're gonna flip them over, and we're gonna use the self-tapping Zerk fittings, and they are gonna go into the innermost part of the upper control arm. So these are actually gonna be a 3/8 size. I'm gonna make sure that these go in fairly straight. This is sketchy because this gets messed up. There's really no going back from here. You can see I've got the directions in front of me because Camburg provided some good pictures so you can see kind of how this is supposed to look. The Zerk fitting pointing towards away from the car so that you have easier access to them once they're installed. So now that the Zerk fittings are in and we didn't bottom them out according to the instructions, now we can start to install the bushings by pressing them into the inside and outside. They did supply some grease, so we're going to use this, and we're going to put some of this around the outside diameter of the bushings and pretty much just press them in. Now that these are in, now we can go ahead and bring it over to the truck and install it. So for the install, we're going to be reusing the factory bolt, but they did supply new washers for us. So the way that this orientation is going to look going into the truck, we're going to have a washer. We have our bushing. We have our guide that's actually going to go inside of here. Press that guy in there. Now these are going to go pass all the way through. We're going to have another washer on this. And then right here will be the tube for the kind of the factory suspension. Then we'll add an additional washer for this side. We're going to have the guide right here.
This is going to pass through another washer, and then we're going to use a supplied nut and add some red Loctite and torque everything down on this top end. So let's get this put inside the truck and get everything lined up, and then we can move on to our uniball joint. So I have the control arm in and that upper bolt's torqued. They recommend you do it now so that you can make sure that there is enough movement in the control arm before bolting everything back together. Obviously I have my brake line hooked up here, and so from now would be the point that we're going to go ahead and reinstall the basically the strut, so the new Fox suspension. The coilover directions tell you to now attach the spindle up here, but I want this to be separated so that it's a lot easier to get that coilover inside. So the way that these are shipped, it comes with 2.25 inches of lift, which according to the directions is roughly stock height, if not a little bit more level. So we're actually going to be raising this up a little bit to add some more height out of it. In doing so, it does create more preload, in which case we are going to need to add a little bump stop spacer, which was included in the kit. I most likely am going to want to lift it more, but I'm just going to throw these on the way that they are and take a kind of an idea of how much I actually want to lift them up. So now we have the coilover in. I really am happy with the color combination with the Camburg silver fox with the orange. I think it all blends really well. I was kind of worried about getting different colored control arms because I wanted it to kind of match as best as it could. So now from this point, we can pretty much go in reverse order. The only thing special is going to be the upper control arm with the new fittings and new bolts and whatnot that's going to go in here. So now from this point, we can go ahead and start assembling, based on the orientation of the Camburg upper control arms, how to get this into the spindle. So this is going to be kind of a little bit of harder part that I may have to get some extra hands in here to get this all lined up. So now the upper control arm is completely torqued. And lastly, before we throw this cap on, we're going to apply some grease to the inside of the uniball up top, and then we can install the cap. And that's going to be it for the control arms. Then we can continue on with the coilover install. Now they did supply some fishing line that we're going to use to help release air once we go to press that cap on, because it's not going to want to go on because that air has to go somewhere. So we're going to put about 2 inches or so inside, and then we can go ahead and just lightly press it on so that air has somewhere to go. Finish routing up the brake line with the supplied little clamps, and then we can go ahead and torque down the coilover in its slots. Now the torque for the nuts that are on the top hat are 24 foot-pounds, those 4 guys. It's going to be hard to get a torque wrench in there, so I'm going to start it, get it really close with the wrench, and then get the socket in there. After torquing down those top ones, now we can torque down that lower shock bolt, and the lower one is going to be 80 foot-pounds. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and route the reservoir up out of the way. So now the reservoir is all mounted. These brackets are kind of hard to fit these collars over, so I'd have to move it around quite a bit in order to get it to fit perfect. So that's something you guys might run into if you decide to go with this kit. Other than that, it's pretty much all in there. All that's left to do is now the sway bar and the tie rod, and we'll put those back in place now. So now that we have those two on, that is pretty much going to be it for the install on this side of the truck. Overall, I'm really happy with how it looks. Stay tuned for another video. All that's left to do is going to be to do the passenger side, which I won't be showing that on the video just because my battery is going to be dying. And I think I pretty much covered everything you'll need to know on this. Now once you're done wrapping up the other side, then we can obviously throw that heat shield back on, or that little skid plate thing back on. And then we can throw our wheels and tires back on the truck. And the biggest thing to do when you get all this stuff done is immediately go get alignment, and then after like 50 miles or so, make sure you recheck the torque on all the bolts, just so that nothing came loose and you are 100% satisfied with the install. So I finished up the install on the suspension for the Tundra after kind of trying to max out the height in the front to match the rear. It was kind of hard to get the lift just right in the front just because the rear does have quite a bit more lift out of it. This is just about to the max that I can go with the coilovers without adding aftermarket bump stops. I am on a hill, so it kind of makes it seem like the rear is higher anyway. On a level surface, they're pretty close to even. If anything, the rear is maybe like a ½ an inch higher. Initial impressions driving the truck is the Fox suspension is extremely smooth, and it is very predictable. And it's hard to tell the difference because I did the control arms and the suspension at the same time. So once we put a little bit more miles on the Tundra, I'll be giving you guys a pretty in-depth and thorough review of the suspension itself. But that's pretty much going to be it for today's video. Stay tuned for the next one because we're going to be doing some rear lights that are going to be mounted to the back of the camper. And we should be getting some armor on the truck before we head out to Moab next month. But again, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all on the next one.